So our last line in the text, we were saying, dwell in the vibrantly warm thought that encourages spiritual growth in oneself and others, referring to the bodhicitta. And I'm not going to go into depth on that line about how to cultivate bodhicitta, because then we'll never finish this text. So, because it's quite a long thing. So I'll just go on to the next verse, which says, this present age rages with the 5 degenerate conditions, able to disrupt most paths to liberation. The oral teaching coming from the Master Atisha easily transforms these into causes, generating progress within fortunate trainees. Okay, so it starts out, the present age rages with the 5 degenerate conditions, able to disrupt most paths to liberation. Okay, so they say that, in the world now there's these 5 degenerate conditions, that plague our world and that make practicing Dharma difficult. But according to the thought training teachings descending from Lama Atisha, then there's a way to transform these all into the path to full awakening. So yesterday when we were in the forest, Venerable Jampa asked me about something that Geshe Topke said, the story about initially human beings had bodies of light, and then they started eating food and the bodies got grosser, and then they started stealing food from each other, and so that's why they appointed a king and things like that. So she was asking me if I believed in that story. And I said, I don't know, and it really doesn't make any difference to me, because those kinds of things don't have much to do with the path to liberation. So when I talk about the 5 degenerations, which I'll do in a minute, I have the same kind of attitude, because I recognize that, there are degenerations in our present time. And yet, many people, for example, ask me, are things getting worse in the world, or are things getting better in the world? And I always say, I don't know, some things are getting worse, some things are getting better, but actually that doesn't really matter, because, our situation of samsara is still samsara, and the path is still the path, and no matter whether things are getting better or things are getting worse, we still have to practice, and we still have to improve our mind, and we still have to improve the world. So, these kinds of things, and the predictions that the world is going to end, and this kind of stuff, I personally really don't get into, because none of that really has anything to do with the path to liberation, personally speaking. A lot of people get into it, but I don't know, it doesn't do much for me. Anyway, I thought I would explain the 5 degenerations. And my idea in explaining these is, to check our own mind and see if we are contributing to these degenerations in the world, and how we can work with our own mind so that we can contribute in a positive way to the state of the world. Okay? So the first degeneration is the degeneration of time. Okay? So compared to this view of, bodies with light and then things getting grosser and all these negativities coming about, then they say that right now we live in a time where there's no lasting peace, where there's war, where there's famine, and where the material resources are degenerating. True. Yeah, I would say, is this worse now than 5,000 years ago? Well, I think all these things were going on 5,000 years ago. I think because we have more human beings on the planet now, the physical resources of the planet are definitely being overstretched, whereas they weren't before. But, still no lasting peace, war, famine, degeneration of resources. It's been going on for a long time, hasn't it? Yeah. So then the question is to ask ourselves, how can we slow it? How can we stop it? How can we prevent war? How can we contribute to more equal distribution of food so that there isn't famine? Because a lot of famine comes, some of it happens because of climatic conditions, but even when there's climatic conditions, still what causes a lot of the starvation is people's inability to work with each other to get the food to the areas. Often there's enough food, we just can't get it there, you know. And that often is because of war, you know. And it all boils down to, in the end, ignorance, anger, and attachment, doesn't it? Why is there war? Anger. You know, why do people have anger? Because they're greedy over their resources and they're not getting them. Why do they have greed? Because of, you know, the fundamental ignorance, misapprehending phenomena. Okay, the second degeneration is the degeneration of sentient beings. So sentient beings have outrageous behavior, they're intolerant, and they hold wrong ethical views. Okay, so outrageous behavior, yep. You know, lack of tolerance, yep. Wrong ethical views, yep. So the thing is, do we have any of those? Anybody here have outrageous behavior? Yeah? Anybody here intolerant? Have wrong views? Yeah. So then the question is, how can we work on our own mind to subdue these kinds of things? Okay? And then especially teaching right views, teaching correct behavior. And not just teaching it with the mouth, but modeling it in our own behavior. And then the third is degeneration in views, so lots of distorted views. So people no longer thinking that there's a dimensional aspect to their actions. In other words, not believing that in karma and its effects, that what we do influences who we become, what we experience, our habitual ways of thinking and acting, even the environment we live in. Okay? People not believing in rebirth. Yeah. So here, you know, somebody recently wrote me and was asking me about this thing called secular Buddhism. So I went on the web to look it up, you know, and it's this new, you know, modern secular Buddhism, where they're going to ban everything that's cultural and try and focus on what they think the Buddha actually meant. So that, you know, in some people's minds, then the belief in rebirth is cultural. I don't think it is. You know, I mean, and even His Holiness says that rebirth can be proven through logical reasoning. Yeah, karma and its effects, that has much more of an element of faith, but if you think about it, it also quite makes sense. You know, the kind of ways of thinking you train your mind in are going to influence the world you're born in the sense also of how you perceive that world, because how we perceive that world is part of the world we're born in. It's not an objective world out there, but it's also influenced by how we perceive it, you know? So somebody, for example, who has a lot of malicious thought, they're going to perceive the world in a very negative way. They're always going to be suspicious and you know, paranoid of danger and so on because of their own anger, you know, causing those feelings to arise in other people. And so you know that kind of subconsciously that you're creating that anger of that energy of suspicion. Yeah, so it makes you see the world in a certain way. Okay, so seeing what we can do to improve our views and to propagate, you know, correct views. Then the degeneration in afflictions, that our afflictions are overwhelmingly gross. You know, that we have a lot of obsessions. And even the Sangha has strong afflictions. And it's rare to find people who practice properly. True. Yeah. Now they say that here's, from the time of the Buddha, and one way they say, yes, this has degenerated because the disciples at the time of the Buddha had a lot of extremely good karma so that they could attain realizations very quickly. Yeah. And so those beings have already attained the realizations and gone on, and then there's us kind of stragglers. So in that way, yeah, there is a lot of degeneration in disturbing, in disturbing emotions and attitudes and afflictions, because people's, we even look nowadays, and the people who are supposed to be our leaders are acting in absolutely reprehensible ways that are not good models for society. Now, was that true in previous times? Pretty much, yeah. Leaders, when there's ignorance, anger, and attachment, these strong afflictions, then leaders act out of them and influence society in that way. So then, in our own ways, how we lead, yeah, whether you're leading in in terms of being the kitchen manager or the forest manager or whatever, to apply our ethical values and subdue our own afflictions in whatever areas that we lead in whatever aspects of the world that we are in touch with. And then the last one is the degeneration of lifespan. That people's lifespan is getting shorter. And most people say, well, actually, now due to modern medicine, lifespan is getting longer. So does this one really apply? I don't know. But they also say that a part of the degeneration of lifespan is that there's more danger from accidents and pollution nowadays. And I think that's true, in the sense of having more machinery and so on, then there's different kinds of accidents that you can have that you couldn't have before. On the other hand, we have the modern medicine that can help people if they have those kinds of accidents. I've, stayed times like in very remote area of the Himalayas where I'm acutely aware that if you fall and break your leg, as a Westerner, they would fly me out. But people who live there, at least during the times I was there a few decades ago, very difficult to get medical treatment for a broken leg, and that usually would, imply a handicap for the rest of your life. Now it's become easier for people to have medical treatment. Certainly not equal. We have a lot of work to do on that aspect in the planet. Yeah. But they say that these are the 5 degenerations, and the reason for explaining them in the Dharma text is to show how the thought training material and specific can help us transform these 5 conditions so that they all become the path to enlightenment. Okay? So that rather than sit and go, the world's falling apart, there's these 5 degenerations that are getting worse, this is horrible, woe is me, woe is the planet, and falling into despair, then we use these conditions and we transform them into the path. Yeah? And how we do this is explained in the thought training teachings, which is a whole other broad subject. But it's a very beautiful subject because it's extremely practical, because we're always meeting with hindrances on the path. And so these teachings teach us how to take those hindrances and make them part of our spiritual path. Okay.